This is my Sunday school class where we are now in the book of Leviticus. We've gone Leviticus, bless my heart. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. We're going to, starting in the Old Testament, we're just going through. There's a reason God wrote the books in the order that he did. He needed to show in Genesis his original plan. God, Adam and Eve in the garden. We have this relationship. We walk together. We talk together. I gave them a choice. God gives us a choice. You can eat these 5,000 trees or that one. But if you eat that one, you get in trouble. But these other 5,000 trees, you can eat. Something is in us that makes, oh, I think I'll go to that one tree that God said don't do. Uh, God wants us to choose the right thing. He says, I set before you life and death. I set before you blessing and cursing. I've explained here are all the things you can do that will bless you. Here's all the things that you do that will curse you. Choose life. But he does give us the choice because he wants someone who will choose to love him. You want someone to love you who has chosen to love you, not that you forced by at gunpoint. You better love me. Hey, Susie, I bet that's Susie. Good morning. Hey, Donna. Um, so you want someone who will, uh, who's loving you because they want to. So God doesn't force us to love Him. He gives us a choice. So let me start in Genesis and just show you how you got in this trouble in the first place, and then I will show you how I have chosen you. We're talking to the children of Israel as to be the beacon for the rest of the world. I'm going to heal the rest of the world through you. I'm going to use you as that shining example because Abraham chose to believe me. Abraham chose to obey me. And because of that sort of obedience, that choice, that reverencing me above all these other choices in the world, but you're saying, nope, I'm reverencing God. Because of that, and I know he will teach his children, and they will teach their children, and they will teach their children. One thing that I've noticed, this may sound stereotypical or something, but all my Jewish friends way into education, way into education. And I just think it's cultural. Not that other people aren't into education. I'm just saying that that's the thing that God noticed about Abraham, and he knew that his people would teach, and they would teach, and they would pass the law down, and they would teach, and they, right? Uh, However, he goes to the book of Exodus to say, here's where you messed up. You chose to stay in Egypt when I simply sent you there at a time when the world had a famine because I wanted to do this miracle through you. And I wanted people from all over the world to come to Egypt and say, how come this one man knew this famine, this worldwide famine was coming? Look how he was prepared. Look how he has, what is it? And he would say it because I serve the only God. Your gods didn't warn you about this famine because they aren't real. However, you're only supposed to be there for 5 years. You stayed. You chose to stay. So now I rescued you from Egypt, and I'm bringing you out, and I'm introducing myself to you because what you did by choosing to stay in Egypt was learn, and this is the theme of Leviticus. This is going to be so important when we get to a couple chapters coming up. You're learning the habits of other nations as far as how they believe the gods work. And there aren't other gods. There just aren't other gods. There's just me. Uh, but you think that they are. And those gods are capricious. Those gods, the way you have them designed, they just get upset one day for no reason and decide to cut off the water or decide to send a flood or decide to send locusts or decide to, for no reason. It has nothing to do with your behavior. It has everything to do with their mood. And so therefore you appease them. You bring them fruit or because you think that'll appease them. Or you send your children through the fire or you do all sorts of crazy things trying to appease this emotional God that you serve that just does things on a whim. It says, but I'm trying to teach you that there are specific things that you do, that it's what you do. Like if I don't put gasoline in my car and then I go out there and it won't go, I can stare at the car and like, oh, this car has chosen not to go. Or I could think, oh, it was what I did. I didn't put any gas in it. I didn't put any oil in it. I didn't inflate my tires. These are consistent things. God's giving them the law to say these are consistent things. If you do these things, you'll be blessed. You don't have to wonder every day and cower and what will he do next? I'm going to give you, do these things, you'll be blessed. Do these things, you'll be cursed. It's not up to my whim. I've designed the universe in a certain way. And also, I need to preserve you alive. So these are the specific things that you need to do to stay alive. And there's three areas. This is what you are doing that can harm you. This is what you're doing that can bless you. This is what you're doing that can kill you. This is what you're doing that will keep you alive. This is what you were doing that will keep our relationship intact. And this is what you will do that will cause you to turn away from me. And so this is not according to some whim of some God somewhere, some God of the ocean, God of the river, God of the tree, God of the bush, who just decides, I think I'm just going to curse you for some reason. God's like, no, there's very specific things that you can do that will bring blessing in your life, and specific things that you do bring cursing in. Choose life, choose blessing, but it's your choice. So through Leviticus, he's listing these laws. These are the things that will keep you alive. Um, and in Numbers, they reject that, but we're not there yet. So Leviticus chapter 13 is a chapter on leprosy. Um, the previous chapter on childbirth, well, really the previous chapter is about blood. There's a way that God wanted them to reverence blood. There's a way he wanted them to look at the shedding of blood, bleeding just in general, and not count it as a common thing or an unholy, yeah, person's bleeding, because you understand that it's ultimately the sacrifice of the blood that's going to save your eternal soul. So whenever they're dealing with blood in any way, there's a way he wanted them to treat it so that they would have a reverence for it and understanding of it. This blood ultimately is going to save your life. That the life of your flesh is in the blood. That's what's keeping you alive. I guess it's pretty obvious to us, but it wasn't that obvious to them. Uh, they didn't have x-rays and all the stuff that we have. So it's the blood that's keeping you alive. And you're not allowed to shed innocent blood anytime. You can't just stab someone and kill because it's there. You can't shed innocent blood. And when you see blood, understand that it's there for your reconciliation with me. That when you sin, it's like you're losing your blood. It's being drained out of you. But you can shed the blood to restore your relationship with me. So if you can reverence blood in that way and see it that way, then even during childbirth, when blood is shed, you'll say, oh, look how this blood is being spilled onto the ground. Let's reverse that, because blood being spilt, whether is symbolic, is symbolic of the life, right, leaving you. And so I'm just training you that no matter where you see blood being spilled, that you want to use it as something to reconcile. So come to the temple and shed blood in order to offer that back up to me. I gave life, life is leaving, but life can come back. It's just a way that he wanted them to look at blood. And also in childbirth, he wanted them to realize that disconnection from God happens from the ground up, not from up down. God's not wanting to disconnect. That when we are born with a sin nature that's eventually going to cause us to disconnect from God. That everyone has that potential. Every single child that comes into the world, at some point, that sin nature is going to cause them to disconnect. That it's a disease that will affect everyone. It's not up to a God who picks and chooses who's good and who's bad. It's not a God looking at a king or a priest or anybody and saying, oh, they're good, but you, poor person, you're bad. God wants to know that it affects everybody equally. So everyone that comes into the world, when you're born, you have that sin nature. The blood is symbolic of that. So come and to the temple and have that child be circumcised on the 8th day so that we can establish that covenant. But so he's combating what's being taught by every other nation on the earth. That there are certain people, kings and wizards, magicians, and whoever, who are godlike and holy and above reproach, and that the poor among you, those are the ones who are bad and need to be shunned. He said, no, because of childbirth, this is what happens to every single person that comes in the world. So we don't look at and create a hierarchy in our mind. So he's using childbirth as just an example that everyone that's going to come into the world is that potential sinner. And at some point, because of the sin nature, they're going to sin and disconnect, and they must be reconnected. It's something that everybody must go through. So this is not how the rest of the world looked at it. And so God is using the book of Leviticus like, let me teach you something. And so he's in Leviticus chapter 13, he's going to use, ultimately, the Bible's going to use leprosy as a type of how sin can affect us. But nowhere does it say that leprosy happens as a result of a specific sin. Oh, you must have sinned specifically, and that's why you have leprosy. They came to believe that. Same thing with blindness. That's why the disciples came to Jesus and said, well, who sinned? Did this man sin in his womb, or had his parents sin? So certain, being paralyzed, certain diseases, they came to believe, even though it says nowhere in the Bible, that, oh, these are results of specific sins. However, he is going to use it as an example of the effect of sin on us. Okay, so Leviticus chapter 13, verse 1 says, and the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, when a man has on the skin of his body a swelling, a scab, or a bright spot, and it becomes on the skin of his body like as a leprous sore. So, oh, the skin, this swelling, this red, this pinkish spot that's about to turn white. Then he shall be brought to Aaron the priest, or to one of his sons the priest. So God's teaching a nation how to spot certain things. God is doing this before, thousands of years before other nations were trained to spot things. Let's spot this when it first begins. And the same thing with sin. Let's spot it when it first begins, before it spreads. Then he shall be brought to Aaron the priest, or to one of his sons the priest. Verse 3 of Leviticus 13, and the priest shall examine the sore on the skin of the body, and if the hair on the sore has turned white, and the sore appears to be deeper than the skin of the body, it's a leprous sore. So if it starts out pink, if it starts out reddish, starts out the scab, bring it to the priest, let him examine it, and if eventually it's starting to turn white, okay, then it's leprosy. Then the priest shall examine him and pronounce him unclean. So God has designed the priest to be the first public health official, the first in history to isolate a person suspected of a contagious or infectious disease. I need to create a person who is trying to spot these things before it spreads, because they had no idea how diseases spread or that they would spread. It was just always a surprise. Oh, look, I've got this now. Well, and we do we kind of do that same thing with colds or flu, or we're just surprised. Uh, so when people are sick, they just go out in public because they don't realize they're contagious, or they don't understand how contagion works. Um, and so you have to tell people, isolate yourself. You got the flu, you got this, you got that, because that will spread even today. And we know better. People still just don't think that way. But certainly back in that day, they didn't understand that the disease spread. They just thought magically it just started showing up on people, but they didn't realize they were the ones spreading it. It was thousands of years before they thought, oh, I'm spreading it, and here's a way to stop the spread. Leviticus chapter 13, verse 4, it says, now, but if the bright spot is white on the skin of his body and does not appear to be deeper than the skin, so if it's just a deep, so he doesn't want people to go crazy and call everything leprosy. Everything is not leprosy. So if it doesn't go deeper than the skin and its hair has not turned white, then the priest shall isolate the one who has the sore for 7 days. So if nothing has happened yet, if it's already turned white, he's pronounced unclean and he's got to be removed for a time, removed until the disease leaves. But if it's not deeper than the skin, you simply have to isolate. Like when people had COVID or whatever disease, sometimes people would isolate in their room for 4 days. They didn't have to go live on an island somewhere. Just isolate. He said for 7 days, and verse 5 says, and the priest shall examine him on the seventh day. And indeed, if the sore appears to be as it was, and the sore has not spread on the skin, then the priest shall isolate him another 7 days. So the sore's still there, but hasn't spread. Another 7 days of isolation. Then the priest shall examine him again the seventh day, and indeed, if the sore has faded, and the sore has not spread on the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him clean. So he's teaching them, here's how to, let me give you these rules on how to examine something and not go overboard and not panic and go, oh my God. Let's look at it, isolate for 7 days, come back, isolate. Just go to that tent over there by yourself. You don't have to leave society. Just isolate, come back, let's look at it. And then let's look at it. Okay, because it's only a scab, it says, and he shall wash his clothes and he's clean. So there are illnesses like smallpox, measles, scarlet fever might start out with a skin condition that some people think might be leprosy. It's just measles. It's just smallpox. Not that smallpox is, but smallpox is not leprosy. They have a whole different eventual consequence. So he doesn't want, he's not saying as soon as you see a spot on somebody, they're unclean and they got to leave the camp and can never come back. Let's just isolate and then check it. This is new. There's no other society doing this for thousands of years. That's one reason why the Jewish nation stayed alive all that time. And other nations, the Amorites and the Hittites, and we don't even know where they've disappeared because whole nations were wiped out. They didn't follow the same laws. They had the opportunity to look at the Jewish people, the children of Israel, and say, what's keeping them alive? Let me go ask questions. What is it that you're doing? Or they had the opportunity to try to kill them because they were mad. God's blessing them. Let's kill them. That's still like a thing. They're rich. Let's kill them. They're smart. Let's kill them. They're what? Anyway, as opposed to let's find out what they're doing. Oh, your God told you to do that? Well, maybe your God is better than my God because my God didn't tell me any of this. That was the purpose, right? Let me use these people and show how I'm keeping them alive so people will want to investigate, will choose to investigate. Okay. Leviticus chapter 13, verse 7. But if the scab should at all spread over the skin after he has been seen by the priest for his cleansing, he shall be seen by the priest again. And if the priest sees the scab is indeed spread on the skin, it keeps spreading, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is leprosy. So leprosy is so if you have leprosy, you couldn't just isolate. You had to literally be in a camp all by yourself, period. Meaning you couldn't isolate within the camp. You can just, I have my tent right here and your tent right there, and I'll wave at you. You've got leprosy, and now you are contagious. In 2 Kings chapter 5, verse 1, it says, Now Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a great and honorable man in the eyes of his master. And because of him, the Lord had given victory to Syria. The Lord gave victory to Syria. So in the Old Testament, they give credit to God for victories and defeats, even if it's in a different country. They don't believe that God's just the God over Israel. They believe that everything that happens all over the world, God has a hand in it and a reason for it happening. Other nations believed that they had a God that was just the God of Colorado, then the God of Texas, then the God of Iowa, then the God. They believe there are all these different gods. The children of Israel were taught to believe that God is, there's only one God. He's God of it all. So anything happening in Canada, in Mexico, in Britain, in Egypt, there's one God controlling all of it. So it says, because of him, the Lord gave victory to Syria. He was also a mighty man of valor, but a leper. So he's still running the army. If he had been one of the children of Israel, he would have not been over the army. So when people in their army start to get sick and they don't know why, oh no, they got it too. Oh no, how did they get leprosy too? Aren't they just unlucky? God was teaching the children of Israel, it's because this is contagious. It's not just capricious. There's not a God somewhere going, leprosy, leprosy, leprosy. Okay. Anyway, verse 9. Then Naaman heard that there was a prophet in Israel who could heal. Next chapter, we get all into the cleansing and the healing of it and how that happens. This is just the spotting of it. So Naaman heard that there was somebody who could heal, a prophet in Israel, and so he goes to see him. Go see Elisha, not Elijah with the J, but Elisha. Elijah came first, and Elisha. The Naaman went with his horses, verse 9, and chariot, and he stood at the door of Elisha's house, and Elisha sent a message to him, saying, Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored to you, and you shall be clean. Now Naaman became furious and went away and said, Indeed, I said to myself, he will surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of his Lord, his God, and wave his hand over the place and heal the leprosy. He wanted something dramatic. We like dramatic. If it's too simple, our minds have trouble believing it. Just go in the Jordan. Plus, the Jordan River was muddy, and it, it there were other rivers in Syria where the water ran and they were clean because of how the waters were feeding in from this ocean and the Jordan River is just kind of this muddy thing. The children of Israel walked across it, didn't have much problem. It was no big deal. Maybe it was 4 feet deep or 8 feet deep. Like, I'm gonna wash in the Jordan and get nastier. And plus, where's all the drama? We like the drama. We will create drama. Why is he waving his hand and why is he doing all this incredible stuff? Because we like drama. Sometimes, again, we'll add in music and we'll add in, and then we believe better if the person goes into a trance. And maybe God is on that person and they're going into a trance because the Spirit of God fell on them. And maybe sometimes people just instinctively think the more dramatic this is, the better. But for healing, sometimes we just like drama. So Naaman's like, where's the drama? Where's the waving of their hand? That's too simple. So in verse 12 it says, Are not the Abana and the Parfar, the rivers of Damascus, better than the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean? So he turned and went away in a rage. Now we know eventually he changed his mind and he went and dipped in 7 times and he was healed. And again, next week we'll talk more about the cleansing, the healing. Uh, of the leprosy. So this Hebrew word for leprosy is not the same word we would use today, and that back in the day it probably covered leprosy, psoriasis, ringworm, other things also, these conditions. Uh, okay, Leviticus chapter 13, verse 9. When the leprous sore is on a person, so this isolation thing was not happening in all cultures. That's why I brought up Naaman. It was God was telling Israel to do this. I'm going to keep you guys alive, so do this. When the leper sore is on a person, verse 9, then it shall be brought to the priest, and the priest shall examine him, and indeed, if the swelling on the skin is white, and it has turned the hair white, and there's a spot of raw flesh in the swelling, it's an old leprosy on the skin of this body. Like it's been there a long time then. This is old leprosy because the skin is white and the hair has started to turn white. Then the priest shall pronounce him unclean and shall not isolate him, for he's unclean, meaning you don't get to be in the tent next to everybody else. You're unclean now. You have to live outside the camp. You can't have contact. You can't be near people. You can't be possibly drinking the same water. You can't be touching the same things that they're going to touch. You're permanently unclean. Now, here's what leprosy does. The sores start to get bigger. They start to turn white. They start to have a shiny kind of scaly appearance. Then these sores spread over the entire body. Hair begins to fall out. The eyebrows, excuse me, things get worse. The fingernails and toenails become loose. They start to rot. They start to fall off. The joints of your fingers and toes begin to rot and start to fall off piece by piece. In the mouth, the gums start shrinking and aren't able to hold your teeth, so teeth are often lost. So your fingers are falling off, your limbs, your teeth are falling out. Leprosy keeps eating away at the face until the nose is literally gone, and the palate, the eyes eventually rot out, and the victim wastes away until he dies. So leprosy was like the most feared thing. Leprosy! God's teaching, let's spot it early. Let's not call everything leprosy just because I tell you how to spot it. But let me teach you how to isolate because it's contagious and you don't understand it's contagious and you're spreading it. Now, this later became a type of sin. It became a type of how we were to look at sin, not caused specifically by specific sin, but the prophets, the poets in the Bible began to use this as a type of what happens with sin. I'll get into that in just a second. Leviticus 13, chapter 13, verse 12. If leprosy breaks out all over the skin and the leprosy covers all the skin of the one who is the sore, from his head to his foot, wherever the priest looks, he's covered. And then the priest shall consider, and indeed if leprosy has covered all his body, so let me describe this again. If the leprosy breaks out all over the skin of the leprosy covers all the skin of the one who has the sore, from his head to his foot, wherever the priest looks. Then the priest shall consider, and indeed, if the leprosy has covered all his body, he shall pronounce him clean. It is all turned white. He is clean. So the red, it spread, but how do you get clean? And we're gonna, if 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 white flesh, and this was happening in East Asia, so their flesh would have been white, it started to grow again. Then the the leprosy has left because now white skin is new skin is growing over the raw flesh. If that's starting to happen, where the raw red is now turning white, it's like new fresh skin. You know how you get a sore or a cut or something like that, and it's all bruised and red, and then new skin, like a burn or something, then new skin starts to grow. He says, if that's happening, this person is clean. Let them come back. So this fresh coat of skin, they had leprosy, but they've been healed, they've been cleansed. Then they're clean now, let them come back. So he wants to say, here's how you spot it, here's how You recognize it, but also the person is not necessarily in that condition forever. Now, uh, so there's is redemption. Here's how they use leprosy as a model of how sin works in our lives. Leprosy begins as nothing, like sin begins as nothing. You have it, you don't even notice it. It's just a little thing. It's painless in its first stages. You're sinning. Yeah, I just cheated a little bit on my taxes. Oh, yeah, I just did a little of this, just a little of that. Painless, no big deal. But it grows slowly. It often will remit for a while, then return. Like you, the leprosy's growing, and it's gone. Oh, okay, that's gone. That's nothing. It's like sin. It yeah, I stopped doing that, but then it comes back. Oh, well, I just did it again because there was no immediate horrible consequence. See, when I get to heaven and talk to God, I said, you need to give immediate horrible consequences. Let me tell you how to run things, God. The fact that you are merciful and giving people opportunity to repent before the consequence is lovely. But for some people, because there wasn't an immediate consequence, they take it as a sign like, oh, I'll do that again. Oh, I sped on that highway. I went 80. There was no cop. It was an emergency, so I had to go 80. But tomorrow, when it's not so much of an emergency, I just want to get there faster. I think I'll go 80 again. That's the problem with mercy. Now, again, God he's merciful because giving us the opportunity to repent. He doesn't want to judge instantly. So, I mean, I know he's doing the right thing. But for some people, that's a sign like, oh, I can do that again. He says, and so leprosy shows up and it's like, and then it leaves. Then it comes back and you just, oh, that's a spot. I'm just going to ignore that. Once it returns and starts to spread, it eventually numbs the senses. And you cannot even feel the afflicted area. You can't feel it. You've gotten so used to it. And that's when it becomes very dangerous. And so with sin, sometimes you get so used to it, you can't tell anymore. You're numb to it. It's dangerous at that point. We don't want to be numbed. And it's like you want to stick your hand in the fire and go, ow. If you stick in your hand in the fire, you don't feel anything. That's bad. God put that system of ow in there oh, that's bad, right? But if you've done it so much that your skin has been seared and you can't feel it, your hands burn it off, you don't even know it. And it's the same thing with sin. Certain sins you can do so often, so much that after a while, you don't feel it. And it's burning you up, it's eating you up, but you become numb to it. And so the Bible uses leprosy as a type of how sin will affect us. Again, not caused by specific sin. You must have done this, and that's why you have it. That's not what God's teaching here. He ultimately throughout the Bible they just use it as see this as a type of how sin works with us and just slowly spreads and eventually become numb to its effect. And then it says it causes decay and deformity. And that's what you don't even look the same, right? And that's what sin, if we let it fester, uh, we're numb to how it's affecting us. We're numb to its consequences, but it's changing us. And we don't even look like the same person after a while. We're making choices and doing things we would never have done before, and we're just not even aware. And so it's a type, the effect of leprosy is a type of the effect of sin. Uh, in Matthew chapter 8, verse 1, it says, when you come down from the mountain, great multitudes followed him. And behold, a leper came and worshipped, obviously talking about Jesus, saying, Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. Now, no one's supposed to touch the leper. So you have to be isolated. That's what I was. Then Jesus put out his hand and touched him, saying, I'm willing, be clean. So he says, I'm willing, be clean. And he touched him. Now, I had a problem with this years ago. It's like, wait, but the law says Jesus, you're not supposed to touch a leper. You're breaking the law. However, the man was clean before Jesus touched him, because he says, if you're willing. And the act of stretching for him was God saying, I'm willing for you to be clean. And even though we, the person standing there, could not see the results, once God decrees a thing, once God decrees a thing, um, oh, and there's that scripture that says, who can decree a thing and it come to pass if God hasn't decreed it? Um, so we spend a lot of time decreeing stuff and declaring things, but if God hasn't decreed it and declared it, so God's decreeing, you are clean. And whether we see the results instantly or not, it's done, it's accomplished. So Jesus was able to touch the leper at that point. Once, oh yes, I'm willing. Once he asked for mercy, he wasn't breaking the law because he was touching someone who God has made clean, even though we had not seen the results. It was done because God sees the future. Once God speaks into existence, there it is, done. It's accomplished. We're just waiting for the results to manifest themselves. But uh, faith says it's accomplished. It's done. When Abraham was sent to sacrifice his son Isaac, he went along because the Bible says that in his mind he saw him resurrected. Like, I'll sacrifice my son because God's clearly going to resurrect him, because God has promised that through this son, all these other things are going to happen. So that's going to happen. So I guess if I sacrifice him, God's going to raise him from the dead. Because that's done. God's not hoping something's going to happen. He has seen it happen. He's telling us. He's dictating to us what he's singing. This is going to happen, and that's going to happen, and it's going to. He's in our time, but also in the future and in the past, all at the same time. So Jesus, oh, I will be clean. He already knows. So he's touching someone who is clean. We just haven't seen the manifestation yet. And Jesus put out his hand and touched him, saying, I am willing, be cleansed. And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. Interesting, it says cleansed and not healed. Next week, talk about the difference. And Jesus said to him, see that you tell no one, but go your way. Show yourself to the priests. Offer the gifts that Moses commanded as a testimony to them, because you have to go to the priest. You have to still do that whole thing. We've got to fulfill the law. Why did Jesus say don't tell anyone? Because everybody's going to run out. And, well, in Luke, I think, no, in Mark, when this story is told, it says in the next verse that people came out to see Jesus. He couldn't make it into the city because there were so many hundreds and thousands surrounding him. He couldn't. It's like, I want to go and preach. I want to keep doing what I need to keep doing. People are going to just be thronging me for healing. But if I don't preach salvation to them, this healing doesn't make any difference. Remember how the parable, he says, what good is a man if you gain the world but you lose your soul? What difference does it make if you're healed if you're going to go to hell when you die? So I've got to explain to them what salvation is. And this healing thing cannot get in the way of it. It can't usurp that message, because if they're not saved, then what good will the healing do? Leviticus chapter 13, verse 18. If the body develops a boil in the skin and it is healed, and in the place of the boil there comes a white swelling or a bright spot or reddish white, then it shall be shown to the priest. So you got a boil, but it's healed. But where the boil used to be, now there's this white spot. And if when the priest sees it, it indeed appears deeper than the skin and his hair is turned white, and then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It's a leper sore which is broken out of the boil. So don't think well, the boil was there, but now it's gone. So this little white spot, it's nothing. Because I had a boil, so I'm just going to ignore this new thing. Because we do that. Oh, I'm healed of this particular thing. So this other thing that's happening, I'll ignore it. I was like, nah. If you had a boil, it was healed. And now leprosy, it's still leprosy. Leviticus 13, verse 24. I'm just kind of skipping through. Or if the body receives a burn on its skin by fire, and the raw flesh of the burn becomes a bright spot, reddish or white, so you've been burned, you can still get leprosy where there was a burn mark. He wants to make sure they know. Then the priest shall examine it, and if indeed if the hair of the bright spot is turned white and it appears deeper than the skin, it is leprosy broken out on the burn. So don't ignore the leprosy because of the burn. Don't get fooled by the burn and ignore the leprosy that's happening there. Therefore, the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It's a leprous sore. But again, it's this. You go through the same things, whether it's a boil, whether it's a burn mark. You come back, and because maybe it wasn't leprosy, it's the same procedures. It's like a doctor's examination. You still got to come back 7 days. Let me check it again. Here, let me set up another appointment for you to come back and let's examine this and see the progress. God invented all of this stuff that just common to us nowadays. Oh, I'm going back for my third appointment with the doctor, and he's checking to see what the progress is. This is a new thing because again, they've been taught that sicknesses and certain things were just a capricious whim of some god somewhere. And God's like, no, you can control this. You can arrest it before it spreads. Let me show you how, because I'm going to keep you alive. If a man or woman has a sore on the head or the beard, this is my favorite thing. If a man or a woman has a sore on their head or on their beard, so you could be a woman and have a beard. God didn't have a problem with that. And if you have a sore on your beard, whether you're a man or a woman, and because it could have just said if a man has a man or a woman has a sore on their head or on their beard, you better check it out. Then the priest shall examine the sore, and indeed, if it appears deeper than the skin, and there it is in a thin yellow hair, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It's a scaly leprosy of the head or the beard. I just got to teach you how to examine and look for these things. It does not have to spread. I'm skipping to verse 40. Leviticus 13, verse 40. As for the man whose hair has fallen from his head, he's bald, but he's clean. And he's saying, just because somebody's hair is falling out, doesn't mean you have leprosy. So God's, again, trying to moderate this. Here's how you spot it. If it is leprosy, it may just be measles or smallpox. Oh, their hair is falling out? Doesn't mean they're a leper. If your hair's falling out from head, it says he is bald, but he's clean. He whose hair is fallen from his forehead, he's bald on the forehead, but he is unclean. So your hair's starting to recede from your forehead. Yes, you're bald, but you're clean. It doesn't mean you have leprosy. There's specific ways he's teaching how to spot it. And if there is on the bald head or bald forehead a reddish white sore, then it is leprosy breaking out on his bald head or his bald forehead. So you got to look for the sore, but you can't just look at the hair falling out and go, leprosy. Verse 43, then the priest shall examine it, and indeed, if the swelling of the sore is reddish white on his bald head or on his forehead as the appearance of leprosy on the skin of the body, then he's a leprous man. He is unclean, and the priest shall surely pronounce him unclean. His sore is on his head. Verse 45, just skipping through these. Leviticus chapter 13, verse 45. Now the leper on whom the sore is, his clothes shall be torn, and his head bare, and he shall cover his mustache and cry, unclean, unclean. So you rip as soon as you find out, you don't get to hold it to yourself for 3 or 4 days. And well, I'll tell my family later. Now that you know that you're unclean, then you cover your mustache, meaning you put your hand over your mouth because it can be spreading through the air, it can be spreading all different ways. And you cry, unclean, unclean, whenever you see anybody, unclean, so that they know not to come near you. He says, he shall be unclean. All the days that he has a sore, he's unclean. He is unclean, and he shall dwell alone, not isolated in a tent next to everybody else, but literally outside the camp. He's got to live by himself. And his dwelling shall be outside the camp. So in the next chapter, it's going to talk about the cleansing of the leper, what we do about it. So this is just the diagnosis. He's teaching people, he's creating public health officials and teaching them how to diagnose something that's wiping out whole cultures. Again, the Jewish people stayed, because of the children of Israel, because they were following God's laws, avoided so many diseases and things that were wiping out other people. And God was not able to explain, take a microscope and make those things exist. He says, just trust me, do it this way, you'll stay alive, because that's his goal. In Luke chapter 17, verse 11, It says, now on his way to Jerusalem, Jesus traveled along the border between Samaria and Galilee. So Galilee is Gentiles. Samaria are the people who were mixed, that the pure blood Israelites didn't like them, because it's like, well, you're mixed with Gentile blood. There's some Israelite in there, maybe, but you're mixed. We're the pure people. We don't talk to you. So he's on the border between Samaria and Galilee, and some Greek people were hearing about him. Some Gentiles were hearing about him. I don't mean to say Greek, Gentiles. Verse 12, and as he was going into a village, 10 men who had leprosy met him, and they stood at a distance, because that's what you have to do. So they're living out. So he's about to go to the village, and these 10 people who have to live outside the village, and these were leper colonies. So although you were alone, unfortunately, somebody else might get leprosy, and so they came to live with you. And then now there's 10 of them living together. So you weren't alone that long, unfortunately, because other people were getting leprosy. So they're living outside the village, but they say Jesus heading toward the village, and they cry out, but they stand at a distance, what they're supposed to do. And they called out in a loud voice, Jesus, Master, have pity on us. I'm sure the first thing they said was unclean, but now they said, mercy, have mercy on us. And when he saw them, he said, go show yourselves to the priest. So, okay. Because again, when God heals, we don't necessarily see, when we don't see the result immediately, but God's already done it. He's saying, go, it's done, because he's already seen that it's done. He's look in tomorrow. So I'm telling you now it's done. So now act differently. Don't wait until tomorrow to act differently. If you've been healed, if you've been delivered, if you've been freed, begin, that new thing. God's already told you you've been, if God's told you've been accepted at college, start packing up. Because you'll get the letter tomorrow. But he wants us to believe sometimes and act accordingly to what he has spoken to our hearts, if he has. So go show yourself to the priest. You don't see any difference, but go. I'm already telling you it's been done. And as they went, they were cleansed because they believed, okay, let me act on my faith. Right? And so as they go, they're cleansed. One of them, when he saw he was healed, came back praising God in a loud voice. In verse 16, and he threw himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him. And he was a Samaritan. Luke points out, and we're in the book of Luke, and I'll point out later why that's very significant, and why Luke had to say, and he was a Samaritan. And Jesus asked, were not all 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? Has no one returned to give praise to God except this foreigner, except this who's considered a foreigner, this person? And Jesus is pointing this out on purpose. Like, look at this person who's not the children of Israel. You guys are becoming too complacent, and so God is now reaching out further to the people who are more desperate because they're more grateful. And then he said, rise and go, your faith has made you well. Leviticus 13, chapter 47. Also, if a garment has a leprous plague in it, whether it's wool or garment or linen garment, you got to wash it. You got to get rid of it, destroy it. Or, well, he says, if the garment has leprous plague, let's examine it. Verse 51, he should examine the plague on the 7th day. So you bring him the garment. If the plague is spread in the garment, because just destroying clothes is not like they can go to the store. Let me go down to Woolworths and get some more wool. So they didn't want to just easily destroy their clothing. Where were they going to get more? So let's check it out and see if it's spread first. If it's spread in the garment, either in the warp or the woof, which is how the thread goes one way and then the thread goes the other way. That's the warp and the woof. In the leather or in anything made of leather, the plague is an active leprosy. So it's unclean. So you're going to have to destroy this garment because it's spreading. So it's active leprosy. So he shall therefore burn that garment. Washing it won't do any good. You got to burn it. In which is the plague, whether warp or woof, in wool or in linen or anything of leather, for it is an active leprosy. The garment shall be burned in fire. Verse 53, but if the priest examines it, and indeed the plague is not spread in the garment, either the warp or the woof, or anything made of leather, then the priest shall command that they just wash the thing, which is the plague, and he shall isolate it another 7 days. And oh, good, it's not spreading. So he's trying to show them degrees of things. And if you wash the garment, either warp or woof, verse 58, whatever is made of leather, if the plague has disappeared from it, then it should be washed a second time and it's clean. So I don't want to, God's saying, I don't want to just scare you. I want you to know that there is cleansing. There is healing. I'm teaching you how not to have it spread, but I'm also going to teach you in the next chapter how it can be cleansed and clean. So I want to point out sin. I want to point out that how it spreads, but I also want to point out the forgiveness that comes from it. So let's try to arrest these things before they spread. But if they have spread, there is still cleansing for it. Here's the last verse. Verse 59 says, "This is the law of the leprous plague in a garment of wool or linen, either the warp or woof, or of anything made of leather, to pronounce it clean or to pronounce it unclean." Here's how you tell the difference. Then he's done 13. I just want to read these from Matthew. Matthew 26, verse 6. It says, "And when Jesus was in Bethany at the house of Simon the leper, a woman came to him having an alabaster flask of very costly fragrant oil, and she poured it on his head as he sat at the table." So there's a couple of things we have to point out here. Why would you be able to go to the house of Simon the leper? If you're unclean, how can he have people over? Well, without telling us when it happened, at some point Jesus healed Simon. He was known as Simon the leper, but he was healed right before Jesus is. This is the Passion week of the Passion Week. They call it the week that Jesus is going to be crucified. He's saving his biggest miracles for last. So he's at Simon the leper's house, and it just says a woman came to him. So Matthew, which was written soon after Jesus's crucifixion, does not identify the woman. John, which was written 30 years after that, does identify who the woman was and what was going on at this house, because the people are now safe. So in John's version, remember they're at Simon the leper's house, John chapter 12, verse 1, it says, "Then 6 days before Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, who has been dead, and whom he had raised from the dead, and they made him a supper." Well, they're at Simon's house. They're not at Lazarus' house. They're at Simon's house. Lazarus is there. Matthew doesn't identify that because the disbelieving Jews were still looking for Lazarus and his family to kill them, because they were proof that Jesus was the Messiah, and they needed to bury that evidence. So they were going to put Lazarus in jail, find some reason to crucify him. So the early books didn't identify Lazarus, but he's there at Simon the leper's house. He says, "And there they made him suffer, and Martha served, but Lazarus is one of those who sat at the table." I just want you to know, John is saying, you all know that he was at Simon the leper's house because you read Matthew. I want you to know that Lazarus was there. Then Mary, his sister, took a pound of very costly oil and spikenard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with fragrance of oil. So he identifies who the woman was that Matthew mentioned. It was some woman. John wants to tell you exactly who. Lazarus was there, his sister was there. She was the woman who did that because she was aware that she was anointing Jesus' body for the death, for his burial that was to come, and she's praised for that. I'm just mentioning that they are at Simon's house. He'd been healed of leprosy, and Lazarus has been raised from the dead. And I'm just giggling at their conversation, Lazarus and Simon. So Lazarus, what happened with you this week? Well, okay, I was there. They had buried me. Okay, that's a very interesting story. But let me tell you about the time I lost this, because I ain't got no fingers, Lazarus. At least you got your fingers, but I don't got no toes. I was a leper. And so this is amazing. But Jesus saved his biggest miracles for last, because he's about to be crucified. So I'm going to heal the blind. I'm going to raise somebody from the dead. I'm going to heal a leper that's famous. Everybody knows is a leper, Simon the leper. And so that everybody will, so that you'd have to choose. You'd have to choose, because you know who Lazarus is. You know who Simon is. You're going to have to choose to not believe. So I'm doing this right in your face, right before I'm crucified. So you're bringing, so that this is your choice. We didn't know. Yeah, you did. You know that blind people don't just suddenly start saying, dead people don't just walk out of graves. Lepers don't just host dinners. So you're choosing to put me to death because of the threat it is to your position, but not because I haven't given you infallible proofs that I am the Messiah. Okay, anyway, so next Sunday, oh, somebody wrote something. Next Sunday, we will go to chapter 13 and talk about the cleansing of the lepers, And on Wednesdays, we're in the book of Luke. And somehow these things always tie together. It's so interesting. Oh, well, thank you. See, Jan Skinner's like my hero. So anytime she compliments me, she's just always, until I die, she will just be my hero. Okay. Anyway, so thank you so much for for listening in, everybody who's been taking the time to sit, no one ever sits through Leviticus. So I so appreciate this is the one book that people just stop reading, stop teaching on. So thank you for putting up with the book of Leviticus. It's actually very interesting. Okay, and I will see some of you next week and others on Wednesday. Thank you so much. Bye bye.